Support for Asia News Weekly is made possible by the Just Japan podcast. Will more missiles fly over Korea? The U.S. has Japan's back, and a crazy Chinese solution. My name is Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the April 11th edition of Asia News Weekly. In recent weeks, tension on the Korean peninsula has slowly but predictably been ratcheting. It's the return to a cyclical event that begins every March and usually finishes towards the end of April. The impetus for this increased tension is North Korea's reaction to the joint military exercises carried out between South Korea and the United States. In March, North Korea launched numerous short-range Soviet-era missiles, which South Korea and the United States called provocative, despite the launches being firmly within the rules outlined by the United Nations. North Korea then launched a pair of Rodong medium-range missiles on March 26th. Both South Korea and the United States condemned the launches, saying they were clear violations of the United Nations sanctions. Even China urged caution in the region. North Korea responded that it was merely trying to defend itself from aggression. Less than a week later, North Korea fired artillery in the Yellow Sea that splashed over the northern limit line, the de facto maritime border between the two countries. South Korea, following its established protocols, immediately returned fire. Anyone familiar with the region sees the same pattern repeated, meaning that in order for North Korea to win concessions, it needs to up the ante. That's just what's been happening. In the past week, North Korean media has called South Korean President Park Geun-hye a bitch and repulsive wench. In addition, 3 small aerial drones have been found in South Korean territory. Now this is where the story gets a little interesting. One drone crashed near Baekneung Island and a second near Paju, the city that many workers travel through to gain access into North Korea to work inside the Kaesong Industrial Complex. A third crashed near the eastern city of Samcheok. The drones took photos of South Korean military installations around Sochong and Daecheong Islands, and it's suspected that the drone that crashed near Paju flew over South Korea's presidential residence. The drones were not that advanced and used digital SLRs to capture images with about the same detail as Google Earth. They in fact looked more like model planes than high-tech surveillance aircraft and were incapable of sharing real-time information. However, South Korea is concerned about the incursion. Military leaders believe the drones may have been used to target installations on Yeonpyeong Island prior to its shelling a few years ago, and may have also tracked the Cheonan before it was sunk. This is all despite the aircraft being fairly rudimentary. This latest development has made the Korean military more alert and has lawmakers concerned that military leaders aren't doing enough to safeguard the country, saying that the drones could be weaponized to strike anywhere. To that effect, South Korea has test-fired a new ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers, effectively putting virtually all of North Korea in its sights. Previously, a U.S. limit was imposed on South Korea that restricted ballistic missile range to only 300 kilometers. While North Korea does have the capacity to fire missiles over longer distances, military officials believe the South Korean armaments are more accurate and can levy more destructive blows. North Korea responded by saying it would have no choice but to further develop its nuclear program. North Korea's deputy UN ambassador Ri Tong-il said Pyongyang has drawn a, quote, red line for the U.S. and has warned against crossing that line. Quote, "The DPRK made it very clear we will carry out a new form of nuclear test, but I recommend you wait and see what it is." End quote. Evidence does confirm North Korea is moving towards conducting another nuclear test, but it's unclear when. David Cohen, U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, told a congressional hearing, quote, "What we are going to continue to do is to implement the sanctions programs that we have in place, which are focused on North Korea's efforts to develop its nuclear program as well as North Korea's other illicit activity." End quote. As it appears that North Korea will conduct another nuclear test in the presumable near future, how do you think the international community should react? All other members of the six-party talks with North Korea have expressed their desire for the DPRK to cease its program, but Kim Jong-un isn't backing down. Years of sanctions have also proved ineffective. Is it time to move in, or is a smarter move to isolate and contain North Korea? Two weeks ago, North Korea and Japan held talks about the possibility of returning Japanese citizens abducted from the 1970s and 1980s. The two nations agreed to meet this past week in Beijing to continue the discussion. But the North Korean diplomat in charge of the talks did not arrive in Beijing on Saturday to conduct the informal high-level talks. As I mentioned in my previous report, Japan should be wary of North Korea's tactics of pulling on a nation's heartstrings to get concessions. In this case, North Korea demanded that Japan not sell off an office building owned by a Japanese-based pro-North Korea group. Ultimately, the building did sell for a price of $22 million. This incident reinforces the risk involved with dealing with North Korea, as the nation consistently demonstrates an inability to follow through on pledges. It makes one wonder why any nation would want to engage in dialogue with them at any level. Even in South Korea, the DPRK is not following through on pledges to meet to discuss an improved border crossing measure for South Koreans entering into the jointly run Kaesong Industrial Complex. North Korea's behavior in this matter may have also contributed to Japan's issuing an order to shoot down any ballistic missile fired from North Korea between April 3rd and April 25th. It should be noted that Japan has issued such orders before, but never followed through. This inaction on Japan's part may actually reinforce North Korea's desire to fire the missiles simply to test Japan's resolve. If you'd like more information about any of the stories I mentioned, please visit AsiaNewsWeekly.net for a complete list of links in the show notes. While there, you can leave your thoughts on the podcast page or tweet them to @AsiaNewsWeekly. China last week lashed out at the Philippines for what it called a, quote, an abusive process in seeking United Nations arbitration to settle disputes in the South China Sea. China went as far as calling Manila's request for arbitration a, quote, smear campaign to tarnish the nation's image among the international community. China went on to blame the Philippines for the dispute, insisting it has sovereignty over the territories and reiterating it has a, quote, solid historical and legal basis for its claim as proven by the 9-line. This is despite the international community remaining skeptical of the expanded territory and not recognizing the 9-line. Quote, the Philippines arbitration proceeding completely confuses right and wrong, distorts the facts and diverts attentions. The aim of its move is to cover up the illegal nature of the Philippines' infringement and provocative behavior by the abusive process against China and to defraud the international community of its sympathy and support, Chinese embassy spokesperson Zheng Hua said in a 12-page statement. Philippines President Aquino responded by saying they were not provoking China, but merely defending its own interests and sovereignty. Chinese charge d'affaires Sung Xing-yang told reporters in a no-questions news conference that the Philippines, quote, seriously damaged its relations with China by submitting the memorandum to the UN Tribunal. With other ASEAN and with the backing of the United States, Australia, and Japan, the Philippines and Vietnam are attempting to develop a binding code of conduct to prevent the competing territorial claims from erupting into confrontations. However, China continues to state it will not collectively discuss the matter. China states it will only discuss territorial disputes one-on-one with other nations, where many feel it can bully weaker ASEAN countries. China's statement shows a clear disconnect between how it views the situation and the way its assertion over the South China Sea is playing out with the rest of the world. As long as it continues to feel justified in controlling the area and resists collective discussions, expect tensions and, unfortunately, conflicts to rise. After nearly a month, student-led protesters have finally left the main chamber of Taiwan's Legislative Yuan. The group was seeking to implement what they were calling direct democracy, to review draft legislation regarding a Taiwan-China agreement monitoring mechanism. Taiwan's ruling Kuomintang asked not only for the protesters to leave the yuan, but for the main opposition Democratic Progressive Party to clarify its position on the matter with China, as the party continued to block the KMT's attempts to get the pact reviewed in the legislature. The DPP claims that scheduling a review goes against the conclusions of a committee meeting held on March 24th. That decision called for a new law to be implemented to strengthen oversight of all future Taiwan Strait pacts prior to any action on the current Trade and Services Agreement. KMT lawmakers boycotted that meeting, which was convened by a DPP member, and do not recognize the results. The matter has now been essentially stalled, with both parties failing to reach an agreement, further eliciting frustration from the student protesters, who ironically are also blocking lawmakers from entering the yuan. Kuomintang's chief whip called the situation, quote, a display of democracy at its worst, end quote. And you know what? I couldn't agree more. Not only are both political parties unwilling to meet, but the student protesters are in danger of stifling the process themselves. It's time for a true leader to emerge and bring the matter to a close. But how do you think the matter can best be resolved? When opposing parties reach an impasse, what's the best course of action? Please leave your thoughts on the podcast page or tweet them to @AsianNewsWeekly. Are you interested about life in Asia? Then connect personally with me on Twitter. I'm @ChiRanger there, that's @QIRanger. You see, every day I share photos and videos from my life and travels, and this past week I shared a video about a walking tour throughout Georgetown, Penang, Malaysia. I even made a video about Korean construction robots, and of course the beautiful spring cherry blossoms. So if those kinds of things interest you, be sure to check out my Twitter feed. The United States will deploy 2 additional Aegis destroyers in Japan by 2017 to assist the nation with anti-North Korean missile defense measures. United States Secretary Chuck Hagel said in a press conference the deployment of the ships was in response to Pyongyang's, quote, pattern of provocative and destabilizing actions, end quote. The Aegis ships, which use powerful computers and radar technology to track and guide weapons to destroy missiles, ups the total deployed in Japan to 7. Hagel is currently on his 4th trip to Asia with plans to visit China, his first as defense secretary, where he plans to discuss China's air defense zone, cyber attacks, and of course, North Korea. Hagel seemed to be channeling Spider-Man's Uncle Ben when he said, great powers have great responsibilities, and China is a great power. You cannot go around the world and redefine boundaries and violate territorial integrity and the sovereignty of nations by force, collusion, or intimidation, whether it's in small islands in the Pacific or in large nations in Europe, referring to Russia. Hagel once more confirmed that the United States would side with Japan in any conflict with China over the Senkaku Daiju dispute as the island falls inside the U.S. security umbrella. While the visit will reinforce the United States' position and send a message to China, personally, I think the matter will remain largely unchanged. It may even be viewed as a push by the United States to control China, which might result in further action against Japan or in the South China Sea as a show of strength. But what do you think? Do you think Secretary Hagel's visit will have any impact on China or tension in the region? Please let me know your thoughts. President Obama essentially forced South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to meet in The Hague. But as I mentioned in a previous Asia News Weekly report, that meeting would do nothing to improve ties between the two nations, as can be evidenced by developments this past week. A week ago, Japan introduced updated school books and an annual diplomatic paper that reinforced its claims over islet South Korea refers to as Dokdo and Japan refers to as the illegally occupied islets of Takashima. It prompted Vice Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yong to summon Japanese Ambassador to Korea Koro Besho and deliver the following message. Quote, we strongly condemn the Japanese government's approval of elementary school books that step up its provocations regarding Dokdo. end quote. The textbooks call the small islets at the heart of the dispute, quote, indigenous Japanese territory illegally occupied by Korea, end quote. Two textbooks include the islets as Japanese territory. What has increased Seoul's frustration in the matter is that in 2010, Japan only had one elementary textbook that contained the Takashima issue, and now there are at least 8. It is an extremely uneducational act to teach young generations untrue claims and justify the history of aggression which could jeopardize not only the country's good neighbor relations with adjacent countries, but also the peace in Northeast Asia, Korean educational spokesperson Kim Moon-hee said in a statement. Japan further angered South Korea when it added a new webpage to the nation's foreign ministry official website this week labeling Takashima as Japanese territory. The new page focuses on Japan's territorial conflicts with 3 nations, South Korea, China, and Russia. The embassy said that the new page was added to better inform homepage readers. The page in question reads in part, Takashima is indisputably an inherent part of the territory of Japan in light of historical facts and based on international law. The Republic of Korea has been occupying Takashima with no basis in international law. Any measures the Republic of Korea takes regarding Takashima based on such illegal occupation have no legal justification, the ministry said, vowing to, quote, continue to seek settlement of the dispute of the territorial sovereignty on the basis of international law. Korea responded to the assertion by saying Dokdo is our own territory in terms of history, geography, and international law. As the United States tries to enhance its presence in Asia, the long smoldering disputes between regional powerhouses have even found their way onto American shores, as Korean-American groups rally to erect comfort woman statues and include the name East Sea alongside the Sea of Japan in textbooks. Many Japanese Americans are sympathetic to Korea's complaints about atrocities committed during World War II, but many don't think the United States is the appropriate venue to discuss the issue. 90-year-old Michiko Gingari, a Japanese American, said, quote, if they want a statue somewhere, they should put it in Koreatown, not in Glendale and not next to a library. She said this in reference to a comfort woman statue she is currently suing to have removed. And I have to agree. First, the truth of the matter is Americans, by and large, don't care about the long-standing dispute between Korea and Japan. It's been nearly 70 years, and the average American can't understand why after 2 generations the issue hasn't been put aside. Furthermore, on a public level, there's no need to get involved either. Anyone that does in the United States usually is doing it for only political reasons. Turning attention back to both Korea and Japan, the situation is far worse. Both nations continue to needle one another to score domestic political points without ever truly committing to bring about change. Each nation continues to dismiss what inherently they know needs to be done to bring about a long-lasting partnership. Korea needs to forgive, but not forget the wrongdoings of Japan. Failing to do so will keep South Korea tied to its past and in the role of a victim. Japan must also honor East Asian values and apologize in a meaningful way. The way in which one apologizes in East Asia is very clear, and Japanese leaders must adhere to those practices, and should it ever be performed, Korea must accept it. Aside from a younger generation of political leaders fed up with the current situation rocking the boat on either side of the sea between Korea and Japan, it may be the only way to finally resolve the matter. Perhaps one of the best examples of how the two nations can resolve the matter can be seen in the Philippines. During the April 9th Bataan Day observance, Japanese Ambassador Toshinao Urabe told veterans, quote, Japan has learned valuable lessons from history. The use of force is not the ultimate solution. It only creates problems. Japan has spent the last 7 decades working with and helping the Philippines to validate its resolve. We have been building the future together ever since. End quote. But what do you think? How can the United States develop a cohesive partnership with Korea and Japan with the two nations so focused on past issues? Please leave your comments on the podcast page or tweet them to @AsiaNewsWeekly. Toyota is recalling over 6 million vehicles for a variety of problems in about 30 different models. The defects haven't caused any crashes or injuries, but reports link the problems to fires being started by a defective engine starter. This problem isn't only affecting vehicles with the Toyota, Lexus, or Scion badges either. The recall also affects General Motors' Pontiac Vibe and Subaru's Trezia, both of which were jointly made with Toyota. While the bulk of the vehicles being recalled are in North America, over 1 million are affected in Japan. This is the second major recall affecting Toyota in 5 years. In 2009, defects with floor mats, sticky gas pedals, and defective brakes ultimately led Toyota to pay the United States Justice Department $1.2 billion in penalties for concealing the defects. I'm including this story for 2 reasons. First, I personally love Toyota and drove a Toyota 4Runner in the United States for years. Now that's the same make as the Toyota Hilux in other countries. It was a sturdy vehicle, it was a reliable vehicle, and it's my personal brand of choice that I still consistently recommend. I also know that many drive Toyotas in the United States and Asia, so I want to help get the word out. Now, the second reason I'm including this story in this week's Asia News Weekly is that I can't help but to wonder if the overall quality in manufacturing is decreasing. As we rely on robots to complete tasks in rapid succession and consumers demand new products faster, are we rushing things to market too quickly? These defects are really things that should have been eliminated in testing phases, and I feel industry should really take notice. Perhaps it's time to put on the brakes, so to speak, and return to a more pragmatic testing regime. About a month has passed since we first learned about the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The search to date has captivated the world, eager to know what exactly went wrong. Was it a mechanical failure? Was it terrorism, a hijacking, or something else? The search has been under scrutiny, with intense criticism being placed on both Malaysian Airlines and the Malaysian Transportation Authority. Some industry experts say it may take the airlines at least 6 months to fully rebound. As time begins to run out for the battery-powered black boxes now believed to be in the southern Indian Ocean, families must still wait for answers. The search area has been narrowed, but it's still large, and even if the boxes are found, there's no guarantee that the initial discovery will immediately reveal what truly happened. My heart goes out to the families that have endured so much this past month, knowing that their wait shall continue for months, and possibly even years, before the actual events of Flight 370 are uncovered. It's easy to sit back and Monday morning quarterback authorities to find faults with processes. The international community came together to help the families of the plane's passengers. However, the truth of the matter is, when you lose a loved one, especially in a situation like this, nothing anyone can do will ever be enough. Nothing can bring them back. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, and it appears China is turning to science fiction to resolve its poor air quality problems. China's President Xi Jinping raised the suggestion of manufacturing canisters of clean air during the annual meeting of the National People's Congress. Guizhou authorities plan to sell bottles of local fresh air, which could then be served up as souvenirs for tourists. Fresh air in a can? It might make for a fun gimmick gift, but I can't believe for a single second anyone would think that this would solve China's air pollution problem. It's the strangest story I found in Asia this past week, and I'm sure it's not the only one. If you have some strange news from Asia to share, please leave it with me on the podcast page. Once more, I would like to thank the Just Japan podcast for supporting this week's episode. If you're interested about life in Japan, join host Kevin O'Shea each and every week for interviews and discussions about living in Japan. He covers a wide range of topics that are sure to be of interest whether you're looking to travel to Japan or seeking information about living there long term. You can subscribe to the Just Japan podcast in iTunes by searching for Just Japan Podcast, or you can click on the show notes over at asianewsweekly.net and go there directly. But before we go, let's take a look at a few of your comments from the last podcast. From Tokjo772, I think South Korea should not worry about building any serious relationship with Japan. If the United States has to step in so South Korea and Japan can talk, similar terms will need to be done for both countries to move forward. It's just too complex for South Korea to deal with Japan. From W. Johnson11, why are so many people afraid of China? I have to say that the biggest world threat right now is Russia. China is just doing what the rest of the world's superpowers have done before, securing its assets and making sure it's relevant in the future. The USA is in a bad time right now and should act in a more diplomatic way since they do owe China a lot of money and gets a lot of its production from it. I feel like a lot of us in the Western world tend to forget that during the time of imperialism, we were pretty brutal and caused the split between the quote Western world and the poor countries which produce for the West. But now the tides are changing, and there is reason to be concerned. But solving things in a more diplomatic and rational way is better than conflict. And from user Crumb. Actually, I am watching your podcast when I have some free time, but I am really enjoying it. The way you provide the information is the way I like it, professional and objective. This part of Asia is one of the most exciting places on Earth, but because of the long distance from here, it is really hard to hear something from the real life and politics of Korea, Japan, and China. Being in one of the few countries which have both South and North Korean embassies, and by chance living very close next to them, is truly remarkable to see how the so-called enemies are actually living close to each other without the guns and missiles. Keep up the great work you do, and I wish you all the best. Well, thank you, Crumb, and thank you for joining me this week. You can reach the show by emailing podcast@asianewsweekly.net, and if you use iTunes or Stitcher, I hope you'll take a quick second to rate the show there. Well, that's it for this week's episode. I'm Steve Miller, and until next time, stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.